It's long past midnight on the frozen edge of the Roman Empire, and the most powerful man alive cannot sleep. Outside his tent, a war with no end. Behind him, a plague that has emptied whole cities. Inside him, a failing body and a court full of men who want him dead. Marcus Aurelius has every reason on earth to despair. Instead, he lights a lamp and he writes a note to himself. Just 85 words. And buried in the middle of them sits a line so strange, it sounds like a riddle. The thing standing in your way is the way. Not around the obstacle. Through it. Because of it. 2,000 years later, that riddle would be the last thing standing between a man and the ashes of everything he had built. And he would smile. But to understand why, we have to start with a boulder in the middle of a road. Here's an old story. A king lays a heavy boulder across the main road, then hides to watch. Merchants arrive, curse the rock, and turn back. Soldiers complain and go around it. Everyone treats the stone as an outrage, an insult to the smooth life they felt owed. Then a peasant comes along, sees the rock, and simply starts to push. He strains for an hour, filthy and exhausted, until it finally rolls aside. And there, in the dirt beneath it, sits a purse of gold the king left for whoever moved the stone. Here is Ryan Holiday's claim, drawn straight from the ancient Stoics. The obstacle in your path is not blocking your reward. It is the reward if you know how to work it. And working it takes 3 moves, always in this order. How you see it, how you act on it, and how you endure it. Perception, action, will. Start with how you see, because everything downstream depends on it. 19 years old and brand new to business. John D. Rockefeller watched the market collapse in the panic of 1857. Grown men wiped out overnight. Fortunes vanishing like smoke. It should have terrified him. But where everyone else saw catastrophe, Rockefeller saw a classroom. He called these crashes his school of adversity, and he studied them coldly, refusing to feel the fear that was ruining the men around him. Booms made people reckless and stupid. He decided it was the busts that told the truth. So while the market screamed, he watched and learned and waited. That single discipline, refusing to let the event dictate the emotion, is what let a teenage bookkeeper become the richest man in American history. The disaster never changed. What Rockefeller did with his own eyes changed everything. But it's easy to stay calm when you can still walk away. What about when everything is taken from you? In 1966, the boxer Reuben Hurricane Carter was convicted of a triple murder he did not commit and handed 3 life sentences, 19 years in a cell, for nothing. He could have dissolved into rage. Most of us would. Instead, from his very first day, Carter refused to wear the prison uniform, refused the prison food, refused to accept that they had taken anything that truly belonged to him. They can lock up my body, he reasoned, but not my mind. He read. He studied law. He guarded the one thing no guard could ever confiscate, the power to decide what his ordeal meant. As Shakespeare wrote, there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. Carter's prison was real. His imprisonment was a choice he simply refused to make. Seeing clearly under pressure is a physical skill, and it can be trained. During the Civil War, an artillery shell once exploded so close to General Ulysses Grant that every man around him hit the dirt. Grant didn't flinch. On a steamboat that blew apart, on a battlefield where debris rained from the sky, witnesses kept noticing the same eerie thing. The man simply would not lose his composure. And this wasn't some gift he was born with. Centuries later, NASA discovered the very same truth building astronauts. Panic is what kills you in a crisis. So they trained it out, hour after hour, until John Glenn could orbit the Earth with a heart rate under 100. Fear is just a rush of chemistry, nothing more. The Stoics called the trained calm beneath it apatheia. You cannot always choose the emergency. You can absolutely rehearse the nerve to meet it. There's a second move hidden inside perception, and it's the hardest of all. Get yourself out of the way. The legendary swordsman Miyamoto Musashi taught that a warrior has 2 kinds of sight: the perceiving eye, which sees only what is actually there, and the weaker observing eye, which sees only what it fears and craves. Most of us drown our problems in that observing eye. The Stoics had a cure: cut the world in two. Some things are up to you: your judgment, your effort, your response. Most things are not, and those you release. When the pitcher Tommy John destroyed his elbow, a career-ending injury, he didn't waste a breath on why me. He asked his surgeon a single question: is there any chance at all, however small? There was. So he poured everything into that sliver and let the rest go, and pitched on a rebuilt arm for another 14 years. Strip away, is this fair? Ask only, what here is mine to do? And when you finally master how you see, something flips. December 1944, the Germans smash a massive surprise offensive through the Allied lines, the assault that became the Battle of the Bulge. Panic rippled through headquarters. But General Eisenhower stood up and told his commanders, in effect, this situation is to be treated as an opportunity for us, and not a disaster. And he was right. By lunging forward, the enemy had left themselves dangerously exposed, and the Allies turned the ambush into the destruction of the German army. That is the entire discipline of perception in a single line. The very same event is a catastrophe or a gift, depending only on the eyes that meet it. Laura Ingalls Wilder put it plainly: there's good in everything, if only we look for it. But spotting the opening is worthless if you freeze in front of it. Perception now hands off the baton. You have to move. In ancient Athens, there lived a boy who seemed cursed from birth. Demosthenes was sickly, fatherless, and cheated out of his entire inheritance by the very guardians meant to protect him. Worst of all, he had a crippling stutter, a fatal flaw for anyone who dreamed, as he did, of speaking in the courts. He could have accepted that life had simply dealt him a losing hand. Instead, he went underground, literally. He built himself a study in a cave, shaved half his head so he'd be too embarrassed to go out and quit, and drilled for months. He filled his mouth with pebbles and forced himself to speak clearly over them. He recited verses while sprinting up hills until his lungs and his tongue finally obeyed. The stutterer became the single greatest orator in the history of Athens, and his secret was one word, repeated like a drumbeat for the rest of his life: action, action, action. Action means starting before you feel ready and taking the ugly opportunity when it's the only one on the table. In 1928, a struggling social worker got a strange phone call. Would she like to become the first woman to cross the Atlantic by air? The catch was insulting. She wouldn't touch the controls. 2 men would fly while she rode along, essentially cargo for the sake of publicity. They would take most of the credit. Some might even mock her as a mascot. Amelia Earhart understood every bit of it, and she said yes anyway, because a bad door still beats a locked one. She took the ride, took the fame it bought her, and then spent that fame becoming one of the greatest aviators who ever lived. Perfect conditions never arrive. You get moving with the imperfect ones sitting right in front of you. But getting moving is worthless without the sheer stubbornness to keep moving. Thomas Edison needed a filament that would glow without burning out, so he tested them one by one: cotton, flax, coconut fiber, even hairs from a friend's beard. Something like 6,000 different materials before one finally worked. Asked about all those failures, he waved the word away. He hadn't failed. He'd successfully discovered thousands of things that don't make a light bulb. When Ulysses Grant needed the fortress city of Vicksburg, he didn't win it with one brilliant stroke either. He tried approach after approach, failed, and flatly refused to leave, grinding through a siege until the city itself starved and surrendered. Genius, Edison said, is far less about the flash of insight than what comes after it, the long, unglamorous refusal to stop. The obstacle rarely yields to the first blow. It yields to the 100th. Raw persistence, though, can curdle into panic the second you stare up at the whole mountain. So the masters shrink it. The football coach Nick Saban built an entire dynasty on something he simply calls the process. Forget the championship. Forget the scoreboard. Forget even next week. Do only the very next thing, this drill, this single play, as well as it can possibly be done, and let the results take care of themselves. A young Henry Clay showed the same trick when a friend despaired at the mountain of work ahead of him. Clay's reply: "Why? You've only got 25 more letters to go. One letter at a time. The impossible alphabet gets written." When a task feels overwhelming, you rarely need more courage. You need to stop staring at the summit and look only at the next step under your foot. And you take that next step, however small, as though it were the entire point. Because how you do anything is how you do everything. Steve Jobs learned this from his adoptive father, a craftsman who built cabinets. The old man insisted on using beautiful wood, even on the back of a cabinet, the side that faces the wall, that no customer will ever see. A real craftsman, he said, cares about the parts nobody sees. Before they ever reached the White House, Andrew Johnson stitched clothes as a tailor, and James Garfield swept floors as a janitor, and each did that humble work with a pride that later carried them all the way to the top. There is no task so small it can't be done with excellence, and no excellence so private that it doesn't quietly shape who you're becoming. Pour yourself fully into the unglamorous thing in front of you. That isn't beneath the mission. That is the mission. Action isn't always a frontal assault. Sometimes it's pure cunning. Samuel Zemery, a humble fruit peddler, went to war with United Fruit, a corporate giant so vast it owned entire governments. Zemery needed to run his trains across a river, but a bridge required permits the giant would block forever. So he didn't build a bridge. He built 2 long piers, one on each bank, and simply laid a temporary pontoon between them. To the officials trying to stop him, he shrugged. Why, that's no bridge. That's just a couple of little old wharfs. The trains rolled across anyway. The Stoics were ruthlessly practical people. Don't sit waiting for the perfect, permitted, dignified path. Ask what actually works and take it. As Marcus reminded himself, the cucumber is bitter? Then throw it out. Brambles in the path? Then go around. That is all you need to know. There's an even higher form of action, making the obstacle destroy itself. When George Washington couldn't beat the British Army head-on, he stopped trying. He retreated, harassed, and let their own size and impatience slowly wear them down. When Gandhi faced the entire British Empire, he didn't fight its force at all. He refused it, and turned the world's disgust at that force into the very weapon that broke it. Alexander the Great, still just a boy, tamed a horse no grown man could ride, not by overpowering it, but by noticing it was terrified of its own shadow, and quietly turning it to face the sun. The pattern holds again and again. The harder your opponent pushes, the more of that force can be redirected right back against them. The obstacle's own strength becomes the lever that moves it. You don't always have to be stronger. You have to make its power work for you. The boldest move of all is to take the very thing meant to destroy you and stand on top of it. In 2008, a scandal threatened to end Barack Obama's campaign. Furious sermons from his former pastor replayed on an endless loop. His advisors braced for damage control. Instead, Obama walked straight toward the fire and delivered a landmark speech on race in America, turning the attack into the moment that came to define him. As one of his aides famously put it, "You never want a serious crisis to go to waste." That is the discipline of action at full height, not merely surviving the obstacle, but using it as your platform. And yet, sometimes you will do everything right, act flawlessly, and still lose. The market crashes anyway. The illness wins anyway. The verdict comes back wrong. Perception fails. Action fails. And that is exactly where the last and deepest discipline begins. Will is what's left when nothing else has worked. And its patron saint is Abraham Lincoln. Long before the presidency, Lincoln was crushed by a depression so black that his friends quietly hid the knives and razors, afraid he wouldn't survive the night. Twice, it nearly took him, but he did not die, and slowly he came to believe he had been left alive to do something hard. That private, lifelong wrestling with despair became the exact strength a fracturing nation would need, a leader who could carry unbearable grief, bury hundreds of thousands of sons, and still hold the Union together without shattering. His favorite words, in triumph and in agony alike, were only 4, "This too shall pass." The Stoics had their own phrase for it, bear and forbear. Endure what you must. Refuse what would degrade you. Will is not gritting your teeth. It's the quiet, trained capacity to withstand. And you build that capacity before you ever need it, like a fortress raised in peacetime for a war you know is coming. Theodore Roosevelt was born fragile, a wealthy, wheezing boy whose asthma attacks felt like drowning on dry land, night after terrifying night. One day his father sat him down and told him the plain truth. He had a fine mind, but a body that would betray it, and only he could fix that. The boy looked back at him and said, "I'll make my body." And he did. Hour after hour in a home gymnasium, year after year, hauling himself from invalid to cowboy to soldier to president, living what he came to call the strenuous life. The Stoics called this inner fortress you construct the inner citadel, a stronghold of will that no outside blow can reach, because you built it with your own hands before the siege ever came. Adversity alone doesn't build character. Preparation does. Part of that fortress is simply refusing to be surprised. Most people picture only success, so the very first setback shatters them. The Stoics did the exact opposite, an exercise they called the premeditation of evils. You calmly rehearse everything that could go wrong. The plan collapses. The money is lost. The people you counted on let you down, not to wallow, but so that nothing can ever ambush you. Modern strategists rediscovered the same tool and renamed it the pre-mortem. Imagine the project already dead. Then ask what killed it. Seneca said, "The wise man is never caught off guard, because he always expected fortune to do exactly as she pleases." Or, in the blunter wisdom of Mike Tyson, if you're not humble, life will visit humbleness upon you. Expect the obstacle before it arrives, and when it finally does, you simply nod. You've already met it once, in your own mind. And when the obstacle truly cannot be moved at all, will has one final move, the hardest one of them: acceptance. Thomas Jefferson was a dismal public speaker, thin-voiced and anxious. He gave almost no speeches in his entire career. He could have spent his whole life ashamed of the thing he lacked. Instead, he accepted it, stopped fighting it, and poured everything into the pen rather than the podium. And the man who couldn't hold a room went on to write the words that founded a nation. This is not resignation. The Stoics drew the line sharply. You fight with everything you have, and then, once the outcome leaves your hands, you let it go without a trace of bitterness. "Nature," wrote Francis Bacon, "to be commanded, must first be obeyed. Accept what is, not because you're weak, but so that your strength stops leaking into things you were never able to change." And there is a version of acceptance so complete that it becomes almost unbelievable. December 1914. Thomas Edison, 67 years old, stands and watches his factory burn to the ground. Years of work, priceless research, much of it uninsured, roaring up in a wall of flame against the night sky. His son finds him, braced to comfort a broken old man. Instead, Edison says, almost cheerfully, "Go find your mother and her friends. They will never see a fire like this again." And the next morning, standing in the smoking ruins, he tells a reporter there is great value in disaster. All our mistakes are burned up. Thank God we can start fresh. This is the very summit of the entire book, a thing Nietzsche called amor fati, the love of fate. Not enduring what happens, not merely accepting it, loving it, every last bit of it, as fuel. The fighter Jack Johnson, taunted through 15 brutal rounds, smiled the whole way because he had decided to enjoy even this. The obstacle was not in Edison's way that night. The fire was the way. There's one force that makes will feel almost superhuman, a cause larger than yourself. Shot down over Vietnam, the Navy pilot James Stockdale spent 7 years inside a brutal prison camp, much of it alone and in chains. What kept him whole was not personal toughness. It was his sense of responsibility for the men imprisoned alongside him. He built a secret tapping code to unite them, absorbed the worst punishment himself to shield them, and held their dignity together as if it were his own life. His fellow prisoner, John McCain, offered an early release meant for propaganda, refused to go home ahead of men captured longer than he had been, and paid for that refusal in years. When an ordeal is only about you, it can crush you. Attach it to something bigger, people who need you, a duty, a purpose, and suddenly you can carry weights that would flatten you alone. Will feeds on meaning. The deepest source of will, strangely, is death. In 1569, a French nobleman named Michel de Montaigne was thrown from a galloping horse and very nearly died, lay bleeding on the ground, certain he was already gone. But he survived, and that brush with the end did something almost liberating to him. It burned away his fear of small things. If the ride is going to end anyway, why waste it clenched and afraid? He spent the rest of his life wide awake, endlessly curious, fully alive. The Romans kept the reminder close. Memento mori. Remember that you must die, not to be morbid, but to be free. Every obstacle you're terrified of shrinks against that horizon. The deadline, the rejection, the humiliation, none of it is the thing you're really running from. And once you have quietly made your peace with the end, there is almost nothing left that can push you around. So you master how you see. You act with everything you have. You endure what you cannot change, and even learn to love it. And then comes the trap almost everyone falls into. You expect to be finished. You expect a summit, a happily ever after, a life with no more rocks left in the road. It never comes. There's a Haitian proverb Holiday loves: behind mountains are more mountains. Clear one obstacle, and the next is already waiting. And that's not failure. That's simply the shape of a life. The three disciplines were never a one-time cure. They are a way of walking. Perception, action, will. See clearly, act rightly, endure, and accept. Then meet the next mountain exactly the same way. The reward was never a life without obstacles. The reward is who you become by moving through them again and again. Which brings us back to the man alone in the tent. Near the end of his life, Marcus Aurelius learned that a trusted general had betrayed him and declared himself emperor. Civil war, treachery, a knife aimed at the heart of the empire, the ultimate obstacle. And Marcus, rather than rage, quietly prepared to do the unthinkable, to forgive the man, to show his people how someone deeply wronged could still carry himself. The rebel was killed before the two of them ever met, and Marcus wept, robbed of the chance to pardon. He met even betrayal as raw material for virtue. That is the secret those 85 words carried across 2,000 years. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. The boulder in your road was never the end of your story. It is the material of it. So the next time something blocks your path, the loss, the setback, the thing you swore you could not survive, look again. It isn't in your way. It is the way. If this one hit home, stay with us. Next time, we open Ryan Holiday's Ego is the enemy, the obstacle that lives inside you. Until then, see clearly, act boldly, and become who your obstacles are trying to make you.